All right, good morning, everyone. Hit
Morning.
record already. Let me share my screen. Share. These parts. Okay, so continuing on in what we have been doing, we started out several weeks ago going over how to do the listing agreement, then it transitioned into the purchase agreement. And now we're going to pretend as if we've gotten our offer accepted. And we are in the next step would also obviously be opening escrow. Next week, we're going to start going over some of the disclosures. But something that comes up quite often I'm seeing and come across my desk is that a buyer will need to be added or deleted to the contract after you've already had your contract accepted. And so we're going to talk about how to do that correctly. It's not just a simple amendment, adding someone or taking someone off. There's actually a form for it. So we're going to go over that today. This class will be a little bit shorter because it's not a long form, but it's a very important one. Okay, it's a 2-page document. It's called the AOAA, Assignment of Agreement Amendment. And the section 1 talks about partial agreement or total, partial assignment or total assignment. So basically, it's really funny how it's written, buyer hereby assigns to assignee, and assignee accepts the assignment. Like, I feel like it's some rhyme or something, but and it's subject to the seller consent. So you'll remember in the purchase agreement, there is a section that says the buyer has 17 days to add or subtract a buyer, assign it to someone else. And they added this in maybe a year ago. It used to be you could do it up until any date, but they were finding that it was almost the end and you're scrambling, getting everything re-signed, and it was a big hassle for all the parties, so they decided to give a time limit to it. Now, if that 17 days comes and goes, you can still do it, but the seller has more of a right to not agree to it.
Would you still use this form?
Yes. Yes. Okay, partial or total agreement. You have some options here. So A is a partial agreement where you're going to be adding a buyer. So the buyer is adding the assignee named below to the agreement and granting to such assignee a partial interest in the agreement. So this is when, for example, a husband is the one purchasing the home and he decides he wants to add his wife. And maybe she wasn't on it in the beginning because maybe isn't needed to get the loan, but they want to be on title together. So he is remaining on the contract and he is adding her. So then you would check A. All right, another example is B, total assignment. A new buyer replaces all original buyers. So buyer is assigning all of buyer's interest in the agreement to the assignee named below. Okay, so this would be an example. A lot of times we see this if it's a wholesale deal. Those can get a little tricky. Don't love them. Don't even know if we allow them, honestly. If this is something that you're running into, you're going to need to ask for compliance help and broker help with that. Another way that this might be used is if let's say a person is in contract and they realize they cannot get the loan, and so they're having their parent jump in for them and take over, and it's going to be in the parent name instead, and they're off of it, then you would check this one. C, other assignment, replacing a buyer and at least one original buyer remaining, or deleting a buyer. Okay, so let's say 2 people are on the contract and they want to take one off and add one more person. So there's a grayed out line right here on C. You're going to write the person that you're deleting. So buyer two, let's say, is being removed and is assigning all of that buyer's interest in the agreement to the new or the remaining buyers. So if you're just removing a buyer, you would write their name there. If you're removing a buyer and adding, you would write the assignee's name in section D. So no matter what, you're going to be writing the assignee's name in D. So if you have the partial agreement where you're adding a buyer in A, you're going to write that assignee's name in D. Same with the total assignment, you're going to write the new buyer's name in D. And then we also have one more option. The assignee is buyer's own trust or wholly owned entity of the buyer. Okay, so that is, oh, I have this trust, I forgot, I wrote the offer in my regular name, I want it to be in my trust. You would just click E. All right. Section 2, prior documents. So once you have decided the assignment type, oops, we're going to now figure out what we do with the documents. Okay, prior documents. Assignee shall initial the first page of each document and deliver to seller all the transaction documents previously approved by buyer, including but not limited to all contract documents, inspection reports, pamphlets, advisories, and disclosures within the time specified below. Okay. Hopefully you're adding this buyer pretty close to just getting the offer accepted. If that's the case, then buyer two just has to, technically it says initial the first page of each document. I have seen other brokerages require that they sign as buyer two on all the right spots. So it's really whatever you prefer. When I'm sending this out for a buyer two to sign and adding a buyer, I have them sign as if in the direct spots, but legally it just says they need to initial the first page of each document. Okay, if you're adding them towards the end and you've had buyer one sign all of the inspections and disclosures and advisories, you're going to have buyer two sign every single thing. Okay, and you have to deliver it back to the seller. So 2A says delivery of prior documents. Prior documents have already been delivered to the assignee. Assignee acknowledges that buyer has already provided assignee all prior documents. So the seller needs to know that the buyer that you're adding has already looked over the agreement, knows what they're getting themselves into, and agrees to it. So the standard is, yes, we have already delivered all of these disclosures and contracts to that buyer that we're assigning, and they are in agreement to them. If not, you can check 2, prior documents have not been delivered. Seller shall deliver to buyer and assignee a seller signed copy of the assignment agreement. That's this form. So this is basically stating we want to know that the seller is going to allow them to be part of the offer before we give them all the documents. I don't ever see this part checked. You need to know that the buyer that you're going to be adding is already in agreement. So I would say not check it, give it up in the beginning. Time to return assignee initialed prior documents. Section C, we have set the standard is C1, is that the buyer two has already signed everything and has attached them to this AOAA form. But you don't have to do that ahead of time. If you think there's a chance the seller is not going to agree to this, you can check C2, which says within 3 days of you signing this AOAA doc, I will get you buyer two signed documents. When I'm responsible for this, I usually send it all together in one big thing and be done with it. Okay, and then 3 is delivery and return of prior documents is not required because assignee is buyer's own trust or wholly owned entity of the buyer. Okay, so remember back in right here in section E, 1E, if the assignee is the buyer's own trust or wholly owned entity, obviously they don't need to re-sign everything again because it is still their same name. They didn't add an additional person, they just changed the entity. Okay, so what happens if you do not return the documents in the time that they are required? The seller can deliver to the buyer a notice to buyer to perform and then cancel the assignment, and it should no longer be in effect. Okay, so the seller can say, well, you didn't get me the documents with buyer two on there, so I'm canceling buyer two. I've never seen that happen. Just get them the documents. All right, moving on. Section 3, consideration. Consideration for assignment. Okay, sometimes and specifically in wholesale agreements, they might be paying the assignee to become party to this agreement. So the standard is that we would like to see the buyer has not received and will not receive any monetary consideration from the assignee for this agreement. Okay, he did not pay his wife to join in on the agreement. But if that's not the case, if they have received money, then you're going to check 3B, and then you're going to write the amount that the assignee has received from the buyer to join into this. Okay. And if that's the case, then the seller is probably going to want to know more information about what's going on, and then we'll decide at that point if they want to allow it. Okay, now then we're at the top of page 2. This is where it gets a little bit tricky about how to fill this out, because who's the buyer now, right? Well, at the very top of page 2, the section of signatures for buyer is for the original buyer, the buyer that you're already in contract with, not who you're adding. So you're going to put the original buyer signing at the top, and then the middle section has the assignee's signature. So you're going to write their name in the printed section. You're going to have them sign there. If it's an entity, you're going to fill out the entity section, which is actually in between these two. And then that is where the assignee signs. Okay, so it doesn't become buyer two until after this form is completely filled out and signed by the seller. And then after that, the seller signs at the bottom of page 2. So if the seller signs agreeing right here where Susie Seller's name is, then you have an agreement. But if the seller does not accept this, then they are going to initial right here in the assignment not accepted. And then this will come back to you and you can decide how to move forward or not. Okay, and then that is it for this one. Do we have questions? Anyone? No, it's a fast class today, but I actually am seeing this form being used a lot. People are, so back in the day, if a spouse wanted to be added to title, it usually happened after the close of escrow. And now escrow doesn't like to do that. And so they recommend that they need to be on the purchase agreement. So this form is used a lot more than it used to be. Okay, well, if no one has any questions or comments, then that is all that I have for you today. So, okay, Nicole writes, is this also for sellers? No, it is not used for sellers because you would just need to do a modification to the listing agreement if you're adding or taking off a seller. Sometimes you may not know exactly what's happening with the seller situation, and you get the deed and find out someone else is on there or someone has passed, then you're just going to use a modification, and then you're going to use an amendment if you're already in contract to correct who the correct sellers are. Anyone else?
Jessica, can you give any other examples of situations that this would be used other than a spouse adding a spouse?
Yeah, I've seen it where a woman and her husband were not able to qualify for a loan. Sorry. And so they brought their father-in-law in. So they added him as a third person to secure the loan. And so he was on the the contract as well. It's usually something like that within families or, partners. Another thing I'm thinking off the top of my head could be, if it's in an LLC and you don't have the correct, you need to have two partners on it instead of just one that was originally written in, then you would write the other owner's name in there as well. I'm sure it can get kind of tricky, but for the most part, I'm not seeing it be anything too complicated.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Nope. Okay, well, I hope this was informative, and just remember, if you need to add somebody after you're in contract, this is the form to do it on. All right, guys, well, you have a great rest of your Thursday, and I will see you next week.
Thank you.